Welcome to the Create Your Story podcast, with conversations on creativity, self-leadership and personality to inspire and support your wholehearted life. I'm Terry Conlon, author, creative transition coach, teacher and personality type practitioner. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to pay my respects to the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of the land where I'm recording this podcast, and extend that respect to the traditional owners of lands across Australia and to elders, past, present and emerging. You can find the episode show notes, your free copy of Chapter 1 of my book, Wholehearted Self-Leadership for Women in Transition, and lots more information at quietwriting.com. Now settle back and enjoy today's show. Welcome to episode 14 of the podcast, and it's the 25th of March as I record this. There's been a little gap in episodes as I've been travelling over the past few weeks, visiting Melbourne, the beautiful Great Ocean Road in Victoria, and Mount Gambier in South Australia. We had a fabulous time away, and it was wonderful to see new vistas, to swim in the most pristine waters, and to catch up with family and friends. You can see pics on Instagram at Writing Quietly. I also met my writing partner and writing road trip collaborator, Beth Cregan, for the first time in person. That was a truly joyous moment. We've enjoyed such a rich connection, supporting each other with our writing, and then creating a writing program for others to join and write with us. So it was so lovely to meet in real life. And we presented our writing roadmap session together in the same room instead of miles apart. We'll be kicking off the next stage of the writing road trip soon, the membership program to help get your book or writing project completed, with opportunities to write in community with support and inspiration from us, and to have fun on the journey, most importantly. You can join our email list for the latest news. Just check the link in the show notes. I'm very excited to have Janelle Wehsack join us for the podcast today. Janelle is a certified life and style coach and a creative writer who also happens to have 30 years experience and counting in the corporate world. In her coaching practice, Janelle employs her signature coaching framework that combines clarity, mindset and action to support professional women to dance with their self-doubt so that they can build tailor-made self-styled lives. Janelle and I met online as fellow Beautiful You Coaching Academy live coaches, and Janelle has also worked with me as a coaching client focused on transition. Our work dovetails around self-belief, self-leadership, and shaping the creative, integrated life you desire. Janelle frames her coaching work around creating a self-styled life, which she also shares in her fabulous new Self-Styled Life podcast. Self-styling your life means, in Janelle's words, you write your own rules and you set your own limits, or you choose to have no limits at all. Janelle shapes her creative, self-styled, highly individual life and business in new and exciting ways, and that's what we'll be exploring today in the podcast. There are plenty of gems of insight to inspire you in self-leadership and navigating a path that integrates the unique aspects of you. So let's head into the interview with Janelle. Hello, Janelle, and welcome to the Create Your Story podcast.
Hello, Terry. It's so awesome to be here.
So thank you for your connection, and I can't wait to explore more about you and your self-styled life work today. So we've connected in many ways around coaching, living creatively, transition and self-leadership, and it's great to be able to share those conversations today. So can you kick us off by providing a brief overview about your background, how you got to be where you are, and the work you do now?
I'd love to, Terry, and it is really awesome to be able to share some of the snippets of our conversations with all of your fabulous listeners. And I feel like my background is something that people might resonate with because it's a story of decades. So back when I was a teenager, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I finished high school and got a job in a bank. Interestingly, 31 years tomorrow to the day since I started with that job at the bank. And so my 20s turned into something that I would say was full of life lessons, or what we'd commonly call life lessons. I was married at 21. I had a baby at 23. I was a single mum by the time I was 25. At 27, I remarried. And then at 29, I decided it would be the perfect time to go casual at the bank and head back to uni full time. So we squeezed a lot into that decade. And then the 30s was all about building my career, which I did quite quickly. And then my 40s probably got me to where I am today. It was during that time that I started a blog all about France. I studied life and style coaching, as well as deep diving into self-belief coaching while still working in that banking career. And today my life is a perfect for me mix of a blend of my day job, my coaching practice, writing, growth, Distant Francophile, which is that blog I mentioned earlier. And it really is a life I've styled myself.
Fantastic. What an amazing journey you've been on. And congratulations, firstly, on 31 years in the bank. That's amazing.
Yes. I can't say that when I started there 31 years ago that I ever expected that I would still be there. But the bank's been an awesome opportunity for me, and certainly a really good lesson in the fact that you can thrive in corporate, and that you can also reinvent yourself in corporate, which I don't think is something we talk about too much.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think something we'll explore as we go through today is sometimes we can find ourselves being pushed from one view of life to another. And I think the fact that a theme or a thread of corporate life can be a really positive thing in our life is something that'd be great for us to explore as we talk further. Congratulations too on all those incredible shifts and pivots. And I love that, like me, blogging, coaching, appeared as key markers and tools and supports in your journey. That's fantastic too. So a common feature of our work is self-leadership. And as you frame it in your work, a self-styled life, can you explain to listeners what a self-styled life means for you and what it might invite in our lives?
It's really interesting, isn't it, how we can language what is essentially the same thing so differently. So your work around self-leadership and what I call self-styling, for me, they both come down to really leading a self-determined life, however we language it. Now, I dragged out the good old Collins Dictionary, Terry, for this one, and that dictionary defines self-determination as the act or power of making up one's own mind about what to think or do without outside influence or compulsion. And practically, I think that translates into a life where you know what you want and you know where you're going, and you live by your values and define your measures of success. For me, when you're living a self-styled life, you fill it with beautiful humans and beautiful experiences and objects that bring you joy and fulfillment. And I think it's true for all elements of your life, be it career, your relationships, your creativity, finances, your well-being, all of the things. And it's about, for me, having all of the areas of your life firing like you want them to fire. For instance, it's not just about having a great career and no hobbies, nor should you be sacrificing perhaps your professional life or your creativity because you've chosen to have kids or babies have come along. It's about deciding that it's okay for you to be excited by all areas of your life. And for me, when you decide to self-style your life, you write your own rules and you set your own limits, or you choose to have no limits at all. And I think you start to let go of that endless comparison that's so ingrained in us from such a young age. I'm sure some of your listeners will have heard that quote that's attributed to Theodore Roosevelt about comparison being the thief of joy. And yet our whole societies are set up to compare us right from the start. From the minute we're born, we're compared by our birth weight, then we're compared by our grades. That ends up deciding what we're going to do in terms of school or life choices. So whilst we talk about comparison being something that we want to let go of, it's something that's ingrained in society. But for me, I think letting go of that comparison, or if you can let go of that comparison, it really does help you to live life your way. And I think the last thing I'd say on this one would be when you choose to self-style your life, you also build out the skills that help you deal with self-protective behaviours like perfectionism, procrastination, and people-pleasing that get triggered by self-doubt. You're regularly giving yourself permission to say, I'm okay to do life my way. And I think that's a really powerful thing for women in particular to be able to do.
Beautiful. And I love that in your reflections there, we had so many beautiful words like self-determination. I often use the word self-directed, which is quite similar, I think, and self-honouring, self-styling, and the term I use in my work, self-leadership. And I so agree that we often have a set of experiences that takes us towards something similar, but we all bring our own take to our coaching work and our unique vision on life that leads us to shape what might seem to be something similar or something that dovetails in different ways. So I love that self-styling and self-leadership can be two different ways of looking at one particular or a many-faceted, a gem comes to mind, something that reflects different angles.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to think about it too, Terry, and I hadn't considered it in terms of a beautifully cut emerald or a beautifully cut diamond at all. But that's part of the self-leadership or the self-styling for me as well, is actually choosing the words that resonate for you out of that piece. And for me, I'm not sure I was comfortable enough in the early days to have chosen different language or picked the words that meant something to me. So again, I think that just emerges as you start to get better at this stuff, as you dance with your self-doubt, build your self-belief, and really start to step into doing life your way.
Yes, I think a lot of the ability to really embrace some of these things we're talking about comes as we get older, as we mature, as we experience more, as we grow in wisdom. But it's all those life experiences, and you gave us a beautiful snapshot of all the different milestones and hallmarks that have come in your life as you've moved through your journey. So with all of the things that you've been through and all the choices that you've made, how have you self-styled your own life?
So if I really reflect on it, Terry, I don't think that I really started self-styling my life or living life my way until I got into my 40s. It was around my 40th birthday when I looked around and realised that I'd built an amazing career, or an apparently amazing career, but I hadn't really built a life. I was working 7 days a week, almost every week in my corporate role. I was fighting hard with an inner critic who told me that I was a fraud and that I was going to be found out at any moment. I had zero hobbies, whereas my hubby Scott had heaps, and I was endlessly counting the days till our next trip to France. Then there was the fact that my role as a mum was downsizing. Our son was starting to live his own life, and I'd been filling up the increasing space with my day job. And it was all leaving me feeling exhausted and dissatisfied and seriously questioning my life choices. And I realized at that point, that's not what I wanted my life to look like. And so I started working with a coach myself to help me build more confidence in my career and build creativity into my life, because if I was going to be able to do it on my own, I already would have. So that decision started a journey for me that I now know is called following breadcrumbs. Mm-hmm. And this is where the blog piece started, because when I was young, I really liked it to write. And then as an adult, I loved traveling to France. So I started blogging about France. And then because everything style related in France is just so fabulous, that led me to doing a style coaching qualification. And then in turn, that led me to life coaching and becoming a certified life coach, and then ultimately discovering self-belief and self-belief coaching. So it really was a journey that started just with that creative piece. But in the meantime, because I was doing all of those things, my confidence grew as I was taking new actions, undertaking experiments, doing all of the things. And that supported me in my corporate role. So I actually went from having a big job to having an even bigger job. But interestingly, because of all of the other things I was doing, I was able to handle it better because I had so much more, I don't even want to say balance in my life, but I had other things in my life that allowed me to, I guess, keep my job in perspective, and it could remain big, but I had other fun things that I wanted to do. Like I said earlier, today my life looks like everything I love and I find interesting all swirled together in a way that's just uniquely me.
And as you were talking, I was thinking of the other women and men that I've interviewed on this podcast, and it often seems to be a journey, I think, that we perhaps spend time focusing on things like corporate or like our work, like our family, for example, being a bit one-sided. And then realising, particularly as we get into our 40s and 50s, for me it was more in my 50s, realising that there's these passions we've left behind, or there's these things we really love that we want to incorporate more into our lives. And almost it's like becoming more multi-faceted as we get older, bringing those threads back in. But I think also to reflecting on what connects them.
Yeah, I'd agree. We're back to that gem analogy, though, aren't we, around allowing things to be multifaceted. And I know for me, I didn't bring any of that creativity forward in my life. And then I had to consciously go looking for it. And what's interesting is how often we don't know what it is that we want to do. So we understand something's missing, but actually working out what we want to do can be a real challenge. And so I think that's where that idea of following breadcrumbs is really helpful, because you can just start with something and see if you like it, and then see where it leads you without putting any pressure on yourself for it to become the be all and end all, or for it to fill up your whole life. You've already got a full life and you can add more in, it turns out.
Yeah, I love that breadcrumb analogy. It's something I've used in my own thinking, whether it's following the trail of the books that you love or the passions that you love, the skills that you love. There's lots of different trails that you can follow. And yeah, I love that idea of testing and trying and not feeling like we've got to find the one thing that's the answer.
Yes, I agree entirely. And yet so often it is that we think we've got to find the one thing. But yeah, that either or thinking doesn't always serve us.
No, not at all. So you integrate a corporate leadership role in the banking sector with coaching others in your own business. So what have you learned about how these two areas support each other?
Yeah, well, we mentioned we'd had lots of conversations in the past, Terry, and one of those conversations has been around how I've consciously chosen to work part-time in both arenas. And that's not necessarily typical for people to be coaching and still working in a big role in corporate. And like all working environments, both the corporate and the coaching industries have stories that tend to tell you how you're supposed to do these things. So if you're in corporate, you're giving all of your blood, sweat and tears and your weekends and your nights to corporate if you want to do a good, in inverted commas, job. And then similarly, we know in some coaching circles, certainly not all, but some coaching circles, it's the be all and almost end all to be coaching full time and leaving your corporate role. So I know the way that I put things together isn't necessarily the norm. But for me, apart from providing a really good example of how I'm self-styling my life, I feel like I get the best of both worlds and show up better to both worlds because of the way that I've integrated these pieces. Coaching's my way of supporting others and I absolutely love it. But I also enjoy the leadership opportunities that come with working in corporate transformation, which is what I do for a day job. I have stimulating work. I've got an awesome team. I have options for growth. And I value all of those things really, really highly. And I feel like, although my team might tell you differently, but I feel like I show up as a better workplace leader thanks to my coaching skills. I have a deep understanding of those protective beliefs that hold professionals back, and I'm able to use those skills to support my colleagues' success. But similarly, I think I'm a better coach and mentor because I'm still working in that corporate space and I've got 3 decades of experience behind me. And my coaching clients work almost exclusively in multinational and national corporations, and things shift really quickly in those spaces. So for me, remaining in corporate helps me to understand their environments, their trends, and even their language. And that, I think, helps me support my clients even better. And then finally, I think one of the keywords in your question is around integrated. And it's become really important to me that I use all of my skills and experience in an integrated way. It's not something that I've always done, but it's become more and more important. And as I said just a minute ago, either or thinking doesn't really support me or my clients or my employer. And if I can bring everything together and show up wholeheartedly in everything that I do, I think it means that I add more value both to my employer and to my clients and ultimately to myself.
That's an incredible story of the value of not engaging in either or thinking, isn't it? It's that idea of, some people talk about both and thinking is the opposite of that. So have you found it's easy for people to get into that either or thinking about their life options?
Oh my goodness, yes. Absolutely. I see it all the time. And as I said, if you talk to me in my 30s, I think I'd fallen for it absolutely myself. And I think what we were saying before, especially for those of us who might be in our 40s or beyond, that idea of having to choose the one thing and get it right was ingrained right into us right from the start. And you can tell from that question that we ask every child, or that every child's been asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like we have only one choice when we answer that question. And I think while it's really pleasing that we see books like Emma Gannon's multi-hyphen method and Barbara Sher's Refuse to Choose sharing a different message now, I think there's still a whole lot of societal rules that tell us what you have to be, X or Y. Well, you can only have one or the other. You can't have both. And I think for women in particular, that means that they can limit themselves. Surely you can't have only one or two things, hobbies or passions for yourself, if you're being a good girl and putting everybody else first. I think my best advice for exploring more integrated options is to adopt what I call the and strategy. So whenever my clients or my team share an either or option, I always ask them to explore whether there's an and or both option available to us, one where we don't have to choose and we can get the best of both worlds. And often I find just opening people up to that thinking can bring forward other ideas. And there can be a real excitement that creeps in when they realise, I could have both. Maybe I don't have to choose. But I feel like I'm the wrong person answering this question, because I think you're the real leader in positioning the fact that we can bring together the many facets of our lives in a wholehearted way. So I'm curious to know what you've seen in that space.
Thank you. That's a great question to ask of me, because it's one I've certainly thought about and often work on with coaching clients. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on my situation, which is post-paid employment in a job that I was in, but crafting my own creatively focused life. And the question I often get asked by people is, how's retirement? So there's this dichotomy in society that you finish paid employment, therefore you are retired, and therefore you're just spending your days relaxing and freewheeling. But my life, my partner's life, we both work in different ways, but similarly are both very busy. And I think it's about choosing to see that the life options that we have don't necessarily fit into those categories that society chooses for us, whether it's by lifestyle, by definition of paid employment, or role of mother or grandmother or whatever it might be, retiree. But I think it's important for us to tap into what we really want to do, back to those breadcrumbs and those passions and those life options, and craft a life. And that's why I call this Create Your Story. It's about creating the life that you want from all those different passions that you have, including earning an income in one way, shape or form, because we need to have money to survive, but also being creative about those aspects too. Like, how do we earn an income? How does money come in? What's a portfolio career look like? Meredith answered it beautifully too in the podcast chat with her, where she's divided up her week into how much time have I got for counselling? How much time have I got for making films? How much time have I got for doing psychological work? And I think that was a beautiful way to looking at all the things you want to do, seeing how you can take those life options and craft them into a life. And I know that's something you've really explored beautifully in the work that you do.
Yeah. And I loved the episode with Meredith. It was just such a beautiful conversation. And certainly I'd encourage anybody who hasn't listened to that episode to go back. I thought it was just perfect for these times. But I think it's also really great, Terry, that you are leading these conversations, because we've talked a lot about the societal norms, but they'll only shift when we start having a different conversation about, no, just because you've finished paid traditional employment doesn't mean you're retired, and it's just that you're choosing to do completely different things in a completely different space. And similarly, no, you don't have to choose one or the other. You can work in corporate and you can coach at the same time. And I think just having these conversations and normalising this will be the start of making different choices for our children down the track. It sets a new example.
Oh, thank you. And I really appreciate those comments. And it really excites me to be having this conversation, to be chatting with people on the podcast about where they've been, where they're going, those turning points, where you make a choice or you decide to open things up. I think they're important times, and we have many of them in our lives, and they continue. I think they're important conversations to have. So another string you have to your very busy bow is working in the self-doubt area, and your self-doubt coach, having graduated from SAS Petherick's Self-Belief Coaching Academy. So how does self-doubt and self-belief play out in living or embracing a self-styled life?
The first thing that I would say, Terry, is that Sass is an absolutely incredible teacher. And so unsurprisingly, working with her in that course fundamentally changed how I approach the concepts of self-doubt and self-belief. And in terms of coaching tools, they've really changed the way I think about approaching these topics with my clients, because unfortunately, well, it's not unfortunate, it's just natural that everyone feels self-doubt at different times and different levels. The bit that is unfortunate, though, is that for some of us, that self-doubt can really, really keep us stuck, and it can stop us from living wholeheartedly. As you would know, it slows down self-leadership, and it certainly slows down living a self-styled life. And I think it's really helpful to remember that anytime we encounter protective behaviours like procrastination or perfectionism, it's just our way of keeping us safe from psychological risk of things like failure, disappointment, rejection, and judgment. But in remembering that, it's also good to reflect on the fact that by not doing the things, by not following what you love, by not taking that brave step and maybe trying something brand new for the first time, you open yourself up to the same levels of feelings of failure or feelings of disappointment or judging yourself. So it becomes a cycle where whether you act or you don't act, you end up facing into the same risk. Choosing to self-style your life helps you grow your self-belief and your self-trust, because in taking action for the things you want, you gather a whole stack of evidence about yourself and the things you can actually do, rather than just listening to those stories that we all tell ourselves about what you can and can't do, or even the societal stories we've been talking about today. And you also get to know more about you, your own likes and dislikes. For so many of us, we've been almost conditioned to like what others have told us we like, and we've never really looked into what's important to us. So I think self-styling your life helps you overcome that self-doubt and at the same time build the self-belief. So the two really do go hand in hand.
And do you think it's something women experience particularly, that self-doubt piece? We talked about societal conditioning.
I think all humans experience self-doubt. It just shows up differently for different humans. I think for women, it's that there is the extra pressure, particularly, I think, as any of us that are 40 or older probably came from a different era and so had different environments when we were growing up that might feed into that. But at the end of the day, I think we all have the capacity to doubt ourselves. It's about actually being brave enough to take a step anyway and just build up that evidence that those psychological risks might feel really scary, but once you put yourself out there, it's not as bad as you first thought.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that reminder that self-doubt looks different for different people, whether it's from a gender perspective or even individuals. Everyone's going to have their own brand of self-doubt. I love too that idea of gathering evidence in the face of self-doubt. And it's something I often remind my clients when I'm working with them, if there's areas where they're feeling uncomfortable, is to just start looking at the facts.
Yeah, there's nothing more powerful than really questioning whether the stories you tell yourself have any basis in fact, or there's any factual evidence behind them, because so often when you ask yourself the question about, well, is that true? The answer is often, more often than not, well, no, it's not true. And it's just a way I've been protecting myself from taking a step forward and things maybe not going my way.
Yeah, and it's a great way of practically tackling those limiting self-beliefs that we've often been carrying around for many years that just become part of how we live and breathe, don't they?
Yes, they do. And that's where I think the evidence and taking some action in the face of those things builds up that evidence of, oh, maybe it's not true. And quite often you end up with more evidence about what you can do than what you think you can't do. It's just a matter of building up that filing cabinet full of evidence that says, maybe there's a different perspective on this.
Yeah, and speaking of different perspectives and gathering further evidence, you also have another fabulous business life interest website presence, which is Distant Francophile, which you mentioned early on, and that's focused on your love of all things French and inspiring others from this. So could you tell us about Distant Francophile and how it connects with other aspects of you and shaping a self-styled life?
Ah, yes, Distant Francophile. It was really my first step into exploring creativity back, as I said, around the time I turned 40. I'd let all of that go in my 20s and 30s, and starting a little blog about France, which is a country that I simply adore, back in 2014 was actually my way of establishing a writing practice. So I remember my son saying to me, if you're going to start a blog, Mum, you'll need to be committed. It's like, managed to raise you for this long, I'll probably be able to stick to a blog for a little while. But he had a point, because I think just saying that I was going to show up and write and post every week, I made that promise to myself, but I made that promise to my readers. And so by doing that, I had to start creating. And I look back at some of the early blog posts, and I don't think they're going to win any awards, Terry, at all. But it was a place for me to just explore creativity and joy and beauty without any expectations. If nobody had ever read Distant Francophile, that was okay. I was going to show up and I was going to write and share something that I love. And interestingly, it's still that today, but it's so much more. And I feel like it's almost taken on a life of its own. I would never have imagined that it would introduce me to so many opportunities and amazing people. We've got to experience so many things in France that we wouldn't have been able to do without the DF community. And we talked a minute ago about those baby steps and experiments, and DF was a real place for me to experiment with all sorts of things. So I could experiment with writing, I could experiment with recording podcast interviews, I could experiment with all sorts of different things that have then led to or have supported me as I've moved into coaching and expanded in different areas. So I would never have expected that Distant Francophile would become the jumping off point for so many other things in my life. And then interestingly, because we share a lot of my hubby Scott's photos on Distant Francophile, there's been a real interest in the fine art photography that we share there. So fairly soon, Distant Francophile is going to be a business in its own right. And I'm super excited to see what the next evolution of that ends up looking like.
That's another beautiful story of the breadcrumbs and following the breadcrumb trails of passions and seeing where they lead. And yeah, congratulations on your commitment. You obviously did take that advice on board. and the success of Distant Francophile, your Instagram posts just beautiful, your website's stunning. And in terms of self-styled life, it really shows, you know, if you took that out of the equation, it wouldn't be the same sort of self-styled life that you have. It gives you another dimension to style in itself and the things that you love being part of that self-styled life.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was all of the aesthetically beautiful things that I love about France was what triggered me to look into style, and that then went to style coaching. And so I can't imagine my life without Distant Francophile. It is the outlet that I can play with the pretty things and the things that just look nice, just for the sheer joy of doing something that I like with that.
And I love that your creativity started as a blog, because that's what also happened with me, because I knew I had to make more space for creativity in my life. And that was how I did it, through starting a blog. I started a blog in 2010. And I remember putting that first one out in the world and just feeling so fearful. But for me, it was about working out what I wanted to focus on, what I wanted to say, where I wanted to focus. In my 10 tips for people about developing meaning and purpose in their life, blogging is actually one that I offer up as a tip, because I think whether anybody reads it or not, it's actually that beautiful way of shaping up what's important to you, working out what you want to say, finding your own voice, plus developing skills, the amount of technical skills that I have learned through that experience that I'm applying in launching courses and podcasting. It's also building up practically, isn't it?
That was absolutely my experience of it as well, Terry. And it always makes me feel a little bit sad when people say, oh, the era of blogging is over. And it's like, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. And particularly for those of us who want to explore our creativity, or perhaps have it on their hearts to write, but aren't quite at the point where they contemplate a book or something like that. Even just starting, as you say, to craft your words, find your voice. I think there's still a lot to be said about having a writing practice, and the practice, as you say, with sharing it with the world, because I think we all feel like that the whole universe is going to read our first blog post, or maybe our first 10 blog posts. And then after we've written hundreds of blog posts. We realise that perhaps they're not, but it still gets us used to writing and sharing. And I think that's the powerful thing about creating. And for me, it created such a community and, as I said, almost a life of its own that I would never have imagined.
It's a beautiful thing. And again, in the podcast chat with Penelope, she gave a tip about free writing and then writing for publication and doing both. And I think that's a really lovely way of looking at it. And blogging is a way of writing for publication, writing for audience. And I think it frames up our writing in a different way to have both those lenses.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that, but you're absolutely correct.
And podcasting too can be a very similar thing. So I'm sure everyone listening is wondering, how do you manage all these different aspects of your fascinating and rich life, Janelle? So can you share some tips about how you balance and integrate it all in practical terms?
I will give you a theoretical answer and then I'll give you some practical ones as well, I think, Terry. I think the first thing is that I'm incredibly intentional about my life and the things I bring into it, because I wasn't in my 30s, but as I've moved through my 40s, I now choose very deliberately about what's in my life. I didn't like where I was at when I had a big job and an increasingly empty nest, and I'd really prefer it if I didn't end up back there. So as a result, I really choose where I focus my time. And right now, I love investing my time into my day job and the creativity of Distant Francophile that we just talked about, and supporting my clients through coaching and creating new tools and new ways of thinking for my coaching clients, and building that into my coaching practice. And that blend of intellectual work, creativity, and service really sparks my energy. And one of the things that I've noticed in both my clients and in my corporate colleagues is that when we put all of our energy into things that don't actually, make us feel good or don't make us excited, that's when burnout tends to creep in, especially I've noticed in women. And so if the things that I have in my life really drain me rather than fill me with excitement and vitality, I don't have a problem anymore with putting them on the shelf. And the best example I have of that is French lessons. I did French lessons for many, many years, but the minute they started becoming a chore and not something that I thought was fun and interesting and exciting, I had no problem shelving them. And it's not to say that I won't pick French up again one day, but for right now, it's just not something that I want to spend time on. And I think being able to pick things up and put things down without feeling like you've got to stick with things forever really helps with that idea of, no, I'm going to do things that fill me with excitement and energy, and I get to choose what that looks like. So I think that's just the first position on being intentional and choosing what you want to do is, for me, how I can pack things in, because anytime I choose to do anything, it's something that I love. So I'm either creating or I'm playing with Distant Francophile or I'm working at my day job. And when you're filling your life up like that, I don't get overly tired. I think because I have all of the variety, it just seems to work really well for me because I'm choosing to do a whole lot of fun things rather than things that I feel like I should do or have to do. I think too, in the downtime of that, I'll cook or I'll read or I'll walk along the beach. I'll still do other things as well, as long as everything is feeling like fun. So that's sort of the theoretical position on it. The practical things, I'm really good with my calendar. 30 years in corporate has taught me that my day runs by my calendar. If it says I'm going to be somewhere, I will show up. And so I do the same thing with my personal life and my calendar there. If it says I need to write for DF right now, I'll show up and I'll write for DF, and won't that be fun? But similarly, if I'm coaching, I'll coach. And so I'm very good at stopping one thing and picking something else up because the calendar tells me so. And I think probably just the other thing, Terry, is that I don't watch telly. I don't watch telly very often. And so I always thought that I'd rather create rather than consume. So I guess that gives me a bit more time too.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you mentioned how the blend of things sparks energy. And I guess it's back to that, bringing together different strands of our life. And it just sounds like one sort of bounces off the other, and back to that multifaceted gem that we've created in this conversation. That idea of bouncing light and energy from one thing to another. Doing a range of things that you don't enjoy might be draining. When things spark each other and reflect aspects of each other, the story that I'm hearing from you is that it's actually energizing.
It is for me. And I think I knew the difference because when it was all work and I was just filling up the time that I used to spend parenting with more work, it wasn't like that at all. And it's interesting that it's a different role within the same company, but I'm still at that corporate job. But by building more things into my life and not expecting my corporate role to fulfill all of the different desires and wants that I had. So it doesn't have to cover the creativity for me. It doesn't have to cover service for me. By just letting it give me the leadership opportunities and the intellectual part, it took the pressure off it and made me enjoy it again.
That's lovely. So we've touched on aspects of how you've created your story, but it is a question that I'm asking every guest on the podcast, and I'd love to hear your answer. How have you created your story over your life?
The short answer is that I'm still creating it. And I think that I'm going to continue to create it just one baby step at a time. And the longer answer around that is that I think just following my curiosity and heading into things in a wholehearted way. And you know how much your books have really supported my thinking when it comes to living wholeheartedly. I think just still consciously doing that and understanding that I get to choose every day, I get to write my story every day, underpins the way I'm choosing to live my life at the moment.
I love that. It's come to this point, but we're still creating our story as we go forward. Yeah, and it's lovely to hear that Wholehearted's been really helpful in framing up some of that thinking too and adding to your own thinking. You know, I think any body of work we put into the world, it's lovely the way other people can receive that work and then take it forward in new ways. So thank you for reflecting that back to me too. It's lovely.
Oh, it's such a resonant piece of work, Terry. I think it's certainly one that I recommend all of my clients. You know, I think you gave the world a real gift when you published that book last year. So there is a lot to take from it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. As you know, in Wholehearted, I share 15 wholehearted self-leadership tips and practices. So to add to that body of work or amplify it, what are your top wholehearted self-leadership tips and practices, especially for women?
Before I get to that, I said the word book in the singular. I think everybody needs to know that there's 2 books and they're both recommended reading on any list. You do share so many tips in the books for wholehearted self-leadership, and I could go any which way with trying to pick out my favourite tips, but I'm assuming you don't want this to be the world's longest podcast episode. So I'll start with the fact that clarity, mindset and action form the basis of my signature coaching framework, Terry. And I created that framework after I'd seen so many women either burn out or walk out and leave just so much goodness on the table behind them. And so it was a really career-based thing when I started thinking about it. But today I believe that women everywhere can tap into the benefits of clarity, mindset and action to live wholeheartedly. So my top tips would include getting clear on what you value and how you define success. I'd also suggest you spend some time thinking about how you want to spend your time. And then when it comes to mindset, I think the place to start is catching those stories that we were talking about before and really digging into whether there is any truth in any of them or if we have any of that evidence that we mentioned earlier. Finally, I would suggest that we take some of those safe forms of action. So those experiments and the baby steps, we pop on our lab coats or our imaginary lab coats and we just go out there and try some things. And by trying the things, by following the breadcrumbs, that's when I think we take ourselves as close to wholehearted as we can.
Oh, what a truly beautiful answer and example of clarity, how you could express that. So clearly your signature program and your coaching around clarity, mindset and action is beautifully framed. And I think the ability to share that with people is also a real gift and something you've developed over time from your own experiences. So thank you for sharing that with us through your coaching and also through the conversation today. So we're just about at the end of our time together and it's been a lovely chat. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with me, and it's been fabulous exploring all the things we have chatted about together. Can you let people know where they can find out more about you and your work online?
Well, thanks so much, Terry, and thank you for having me on today. It's been an absolute honour and a joy. If listeners are interested in self-styling their lives, they can find me on the interwebs at janellewehsack.com. And make sure you check out the free resources that I have to help you do life your way. You'll also find me on Instagram at janelle.wehsack or on my new podcast, Self-Styled Life, which should be out in the wild by the time you are listening to this episode of Terry's podcast. And if you're after a dose of French inspiration, you can join me over at distantfrancophile.com or on Insta, where we are Distant Francophile.
So many places to be. It's wonderful. And so many wonderful places for people to find out more about you and explore your work. So thank you so much for sharing so much about you, and encourage people to check out your work, all the different angles, and to engage with you if they feel called. It's very important to connect with coaches and people's work that feels resonant with you, isn't it?
Yes, I know for me that's how we've built such a beautiful community across a number of these online platforms. So, yeah. But like I said, Terry, thank you so much for having me on. It's such a joy.
Well, my pleasure. All the best with your podcast. Look forward to listening.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening today, and I hope you found it inspiring and supportive. You can find the episode show notes, get your free copy of Chapter 1 of Wholehearted, and find out more about my books, coaching, and other offerings at quietwriting.com. Connect with me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where I am at Writing Quietly. Please leave a review on your favourite podcast app too to help others find the show and create their story. And warmest wishes for you as you create your story in the world.